You have a problem right now. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's something at work that's been eating at you for weeks. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there is a person you could call, someone who would help. But you haven't called. You probably won't. And you're not entirely sure why. That silence isn't weakness. It isn't stubbornness. It is one of the most deeply wired patterns in human psychology. And the story of how it got there starts long before you were born. Psychologists have a name for it. They call it self-reliance compulsion. The compulsion to solve your own problems, to carry your own weight, to never let another person see the cracks. And for decades, therapists assumed it was mostly about pride, a fragile ego, a fear of looking weak. But the research tells a different story. In 1985, a researcher named Sidney Rosen at Bowling Green State University began studying what he called the reluctance to seek help. He ran a series of experiments where participants were given difficult problems and given clear access to expert assistance that would have genuinely helped them. Most of them never asked. Not because they didn't know help was available, they knew. They just didn't reach for it. When Rosen dug into the reasons, what he found wasn't arrogance. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like grief. Asking for help, his subject said, felt like admitting that something was wrong with them. Think about that for a moment. Not that something was wrong with the situation, not that the problem was hard, that something was wrong with them. The request for help and the sense of personal failure had become fused together in their minds, inseparable, automatic, and almost impossible to override, even when they wanted to. But where does that fusion come from? This is where the evolutionary picture gets strange. For most of human history, you lived in a group of between 20 and 150 people. Researchers like Robin Dunbar at Oxford have spent decades mapping the structure of human social groups. And what they found is that this number, somewhere around 150, appears again and again across cultures, across time, across every social configuration humans have built. It seems to be the limit of the number of people you can truly know, the number of people whose relationships you can track, whose loyalties you can predict, whose goodwill you can reasonably count on. In that world, everyone knew everything about everyone. Your failures were visible. Your struggles were shared. And asking for help wasn't a private transaction between two people. It was a public declaration of where you stood in the social hierarchy. Because in that world, help had a price. Not money, not favors, something older and more biological than either. Status. Every time you asked for help, you were signaling to everyone watching that you needed something you couldn't provide for yourself. And in a group where your survival depended on your perceived value to the collective, that signal mattered. It could affect who shared food with you, who chose you as a mate, who came to your defense when a threat appeared. The psychologist Roy Baumeister at the University of Queensland has done extensive work on what he calls the need to belong and the need to feel adequate within a group. His research shows that the drive to appear capable and self-sufficient is not a modern neurosis. It is not a product of capitalism or social media or toxic masculinity. It is ancient. It is wired. And it is almost certainly adaptive. Because for the vast majority of human existence, projecting competence was not vanity. It was survival strategy. Here is the cruel irony. The same social world that made asking for help feel dangerous was also the world that made it easy. You were surrounded by people who knew you, who had watched you grow up, who remembered the last time you helped them. In that world, asking for help carried social risk, but it also carried social context. The person you asked knew your history. They could weigh your request against 10 years of shared experience. They knew this was unusual for you, that you wouldn't ask if you didn't need it. You don't live in that world anymore, and your brain hasn't caught up. Today, you might need help from someone you met 6 months ago. A colleague, a neighbour, a professional you see twice a year. Someone who has almost no context for who you are outside of this one moment. And your ancient brain, which evolved to calculate the social cost of every request against a deep well of shared history, is now trying to run those calculations without any of the data it was built to use. The result is that asking feels enormous, disproportionately enormous. Your nervous system is treating every request like a tribal negotiation, like your status in the group depends on the outcome. And because that calculation always defaults to worst case without context, the answer it keeps arriving at is the same one it gave your ancestors in moments of genuine uncertainty. Don't ask. Handle it yourself. Show them you don't need anything. There's another layer here, and it goes even deeper. The developmental psychologist John Bowlby spent 30 years studying what happens to children who learn early that their needs won't be met. What he found, and what decades of subsequent research has confirmed, is that children who experience inconsistent or dismissive caregiving don't simply grow up sad or anxious, though they often do. They grow up reorganized. Their brains literally restructure their attachment systems to minimize dependence on other people. They learn to suppress the impulse to reach out. They develop what Bowlby called an avoidant attachment style, a way of relating to the world in which self-sufficiency becomes not just a preference, but a psychological necessity. And that style persists into adulthood. The person who never asks for help at work, who handles every crisis alone, who deflects every offer of support with a quick, "I'm fine," that person often isn't choosing independence. They are enacting a strategy their nervous system developed before they were old enough to understand what was happening. A strategy that protected them once. A strategy that may be costing them everything now. Here is what the research says about that cost. A 2014 meta-analysis published in PLOS One examined more than 140 studies on social support and health outcomes. The conclusion was stark. People with strong support networks, people who both give and receive help regularly, live longer, recover from illness faster, report lower rates of depression and anxiety, and show measurably better cognitive function into old age. The inability to ask for help isn't a sign of strength. Biologically, structurally, at the level of cells and nervous systems and immune function, it is a form of chronic stress. And chronic stress kills slowly and thoroughly. But knowing this doesn't automatically change the feeling. The feeling doesn't live in the rational part of your brain. It lives in the older, faster parts. The parts that evolved when status could determine survival. When every social exchange carried biological stakes your conscious mind never had to calculate, because your body had already done the math. You can understand intellectually that asking your friend for help won't destroy your reputation in the tribe. Your amygdala isn't interested in that argument. What the neuroscience does suggest is that the feeling can be retrained, not by willpower, not by deciding to be different, but by accumulating experiences that contradict the prediction. Every time you ask for help and nothing collapses. Every time someone responds with warmth instead of judgment. Every time the worst-case scenario your nervous system predicted fails to arrive. You are building a new data set. You are giving your ancient brain the context it was designed to use and never had. The irony that Sidney Rosen noticed in his lab in 1985 is still true today. The people who refuse to ask for help are often the most skilled helpers. They give freely, reliably, without keeping score. They have no trouble recognizing when someone else needs support. But the moment the calculation runs in reverse, the moment they are the one who needs something, the system short-circuits. Because they learned, somewhere, somehow, that being the one who needs is different from being the one who gives. They learned it the same way your ancestors learned to be cautious in a world where social mistakes could be fatal. Not as a lesson, as a reflex. Tonight, when something is hard and you think about reaching out, and then you don't, that hesitation is ancient. It is not a character flaw. It is an evolutionary hangover from a world where the cost of asking was real, where status was survival, where your brain ran constant calculations about what your needs might cost you in the currency of belonging. You are not broken. You are prehistoric. And the most radical thing you can do in the world you actually live in, surrounded by people who are not tracking your status in the tribe, is to pick up the phone and ask.